After the talk is concluded, then we'll have time both for questions that people have submitted in advance when you signed up, as well as some questions that arise during the course of the talk. So if you want to place any questions in the chat, feel free to do that, and we'll try to address them. We'll do our best to address everybody's questions, but understand there's many people participating. And so we thank you for your patience and understanding as we try and address all of the issues together. And I also want to announce one upcoming event that our working group has put together. So on Friday, November 6th at 6 p.m., we're hosting Catherine Marino, so professor at UC Berkeley, for a brief talk and discussion of her award-winning book, Feminism for the Americas, The Making of an International Human Rights Movement. I think it's Berkeley. Is it UCLA? I'm sorry, I'm double. Yeah, it's UCLA. And so again, thanks so much for your participation. And now I'm going to introduce Florence Babb and then turn it over to her so that you can introduce our keynote speaker tonight. And Florence Babb is a Harrington Distinguished Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a cultural anthropologist specializing in gender and sexuality, as well as race and class and changing contexts in Latin America. She's author of numerous books. One that might be particularly related to tonight is from 2001, called After Revolution, Mapping Gender and Cultural Politics in Neoliberal Nicaragua, which was reissued in 2012 in translation. Después de la Revolución, Género y Cultura Política en Nicaragua Neoliberal. And then her most recent book came out in 2018, Women's Place in the Andes, Engaging Decolonial Feminist Anthropology. I think that's your most recent still, right, Florence?
Yes, it is.
Great. So thanks again. I just learned that you two go back, it sounds like, to 1993, which is really lovely. Thanks again, everyone, for being here, and I'll turn it over to Florence Babb.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thanks to all the graduate students who organized this fabulous event. I'm really delighted that we're doing this, and I'm so pleased also to introduce Margaret Randall. It's really an honor. Margaret is a feminist poet, a memoirist, translator, photographer, and social activist par excellence. Most of you will be familiar with Margaret's prolific writing career and her dedication to social struggles in the Americas over her amazing lifetime. Many may know that she lived for substantial periods of the 1960s through the 80s in Mexico, Cuba, and Nicaragua, where she was integral to those nations' artistic and political currents, founding a bilingual literary journal, writing on women's participation in revolution, writing and translating poetry, working in solidarity with activists and intellectuals, all the while raising her young children. So some of you will also have read her recent memoir, I Never Left Home, published by Duke University Press this year, which she'll read from today, the remarkable account of her extraordinary life. And some of us shared with her the experience just 2 nights ago of watching the film Las Sandinistas, shown as part of our Latin American film series, after which Margaret offered her own recollections of working in solidarity with the Sandinista women of the 1980s in Nicaragua. You may know that when Margaret returned to the US in 1984, after living in Latin America for 23 years, the US Immigration and Naturalization Service ordered her to be deported for her, quote, subversive writing. It took 5 years and the support of writers, entertainers, and ordinary folks around the country before Margaret regained her citizenship. During the decades following her return to the US, Margaret has taught courses at universities around the university, including the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, where she lives, and a long-time visiting appointment at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, among other universities. And she's never stopped writing and committing to social justice, whether close to home or around the globe. My own connection to Margaret Randall goes back several decades, first through reading such books as Cuban Women Now and Sandino's Daughters, which helped inspire my own travel and research in Nicaragua and Cuba, then meeting her on several occasions and accompanying her with a group of women to Cuba in 1993. For me, a really rare journey during a critical time in that nation's history. I felt privileged then to have known Margaret and her great generosity personally. And I remember, just for example, receiving the beautiful cards that she sent to each member of the group with her own photography after our time in Cuba. And I'm also, of course, delighted to be reconnecting right now. I've been asked to keep this short, so we'll move quickly to Margaret. So I won't recite the numerous awards and distinctions that she has received over the years or her impressive list of notable publications. I'll simply close by saying that Margaret Randall has had a profound impact on lives wherever she's traveled, and she continues to inspire through her brilliant work, her friendship, her solidarity, and her wisdom. I'm so very pleased, along with the graduate student-led working group that invited her here, to welcome Margaret to this virtual visit with those of us at Duke and Carolina and our fellow travelers this evening. Thank you. And welcome to Margaret.
Well, thank you so much, Florence. I love these introductions where I can remember or be reminded of where we've met and the things we've done together. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone who had anything to do with this for inviting me. It sounds like it's been a great series of events. I loved seeing the film Las Sandinistas on Wednesday night, and I really recommend it to those of you who didn't get a chance to see it. I'm going to participate with some of my own memories of Nicaragua in both words and images. I Never Left Home, poet, feminist, revolutionary, is my, so something happened here. And okay, that's good. Sorry about that. For a minute, I couldn't, the images were over what I was reading. As I was saying, I'm pleased to be able to participate with some of my own memories of Nicaragua in both words and images. I Never Left Home, poet, feminist, revolutionary is my memoir. It was published by Duke University Press in March of this year. The book begins before my birth and ends in the present. And what I want to do now is share some excerpts from the chapter on Nicaragua, where I first visited to do some field work right after the Sandinistas were victorious in the summer of 1979, and then went to live there from 1980 to 1984. So the chapter begins like this. About 20 kilometers south of Managua, the Masaya volcano reaches for the sky. It is one of 19 that dot the map of the Central American country, several of which erupt from time to time and then return to dormancy, waiting in silence before unexpectedly becoming active once more. Among Masaya's craters, Santiago is the most turbulent. During my first weeks in the country, I went there several times, compelled by my fascination with that open wound in the earth. Jaime, the driver I'd been assigned by the Ministry of Culture, and I would wind our way up the narrow road through Nicaragua's first officially designated national park. Reality hardly lived up to the designation, since there was little, if any, visible improvement, other than a restroom that seemed never to have been cleaned, and a rickety fence meant to prevent visitors from climbing down into the crater's mouth. Volcanoes came to symbolize Central America for me, a dramatic, sometimes violent string of cones running the length of that narrow strip of land linking North and South America. Their turbulence reminded me of the region's history of social and political turmoil, much of it the result of US interference and people's response to that interference. And indeed, during my years in Nicaragua, I heard many stories of ominous rumblings or blankets of black dust descending upon a city overnight and disrupting people's lives. I was mesmerized by the bright orange sea of fiery magma tossing and turning in Santiago's depths. It was like gazing into Earth's ever-changing interior, fire heaving and swelling hundreds of feet below the rim. I'd heard stories of Sandinista prisoners having been thrown into that crater. I could only hope they'd been dead by the time they were dragged from the dictatorship's torture chambers and their bodies dropped from helicopters or planes. Yet, when I returned to Nicaragua with my wife Barbara in 1992 and took her out to see the mass of swirling magma that had so intrigued me when I'd lived there, Santiago was again sleeping profoundly. Only a crust of bleak earth met us when we reached the volcano's lips. So that's the way the story, this chapter opens. And it continues with stories of what it was like to participate in a burgeoning process of social change. Everything was new. Creative energy was explosive. Like the rest of the book, this chapter includes several poems. And I'd like to read one of them here. It's dedicated to Daisy Zamora, and it's called Our Job Was to Move Their Bodies. 1. Sometimes in the high noon heat of an August day, monsoon rains coax millennia of discrete sense to the surface of my desert home. Through layers of ancient cookpot smoke, smell of bone, dreams and builds, bedrock to today's exhaling sage, and I catch that purging pungency. 1979, and the war was won, or so we thought. Along shell-pocked roads and small backyards, fallen revolutionaries outgrew their shallow graves. Our job was to move their bodies to proper sites, cemeteries, where a nation of lovers could mourn them in gratitude. What remained of red and black, one arm of a checked shirt, a single shoe or blood-caked pair of pants, now forever sizes large. A skull came free in my hands, thin book of poems without a cover. It was the stench that trapped us where we worked, invading willing shovels, entering living nostrils beneath protective safety masks. I wondered how long before earth would calm the clinging color of death. But today I mourn a greater loss, pure scent they fought for, dunged by imposters, murdered by power, where every hack speech, every greed-spliced lie spits in the gaping sockets of men and women whose last sad fumes still gag my memory. 2. Faint olfactory waves at Rome's arenas, where clawed gladiator flesh screams bloodied concession for the ages. Unmistakable stench of human burning, no neighbor German farmer dared challenge. Defining scent of death trapped on the surface of an old black and white photo, sight fading to smell when senses cross clean lines, explode nerve endings, render every explanation meaningless, too messy to fold and file in neat drawers. One unexpected, unforgiving moment always escapes the polished surface of "we must never forget," or "let's put it behind us and start again." Its rising mist menaces us where we stand. So here now is another passage and poem from later in this chapter. This passage begins, "My youngest daughter, Anna, was 10 when I uprooted her from her Cuban life and took her to Managua. She was shocked at seeing beggars in the street and frightened the first time she was invited to attend a Catholic mass, a customary part of the celebration when young girls turned 16. Religion in Cuba had been seen as retrograde, even counter-revolutionary. In Nicaragua, it was firmly embedded in everyday life. With her youth and smarts, Ana made friends soon and became part of the local scene. My second youngest, Jimena, wanted to finish high school in Havana, but joined us in Managua a year later. From a society that was safe and organized, with children as its most precious members, my daughters soon found themselves facing the uncertainty of impending war. Anna's first year of school was fairly stable, but by the time her sister arrived, classes, more often than not, were suspended because of the threat of imminent contra-attack. Both girls joined militia units. Jimenez actually saw some action when hers went to pick coffee in the northern part of the country, and she happened to be doing guard duty the night a small group of counter-revolutionaries invaded the fields where they were working. She fired a couple of shots into the air and they ran off, but the terror stayed with her for years. Anna was 12 when her all-woman battalion, which included members of all ages, went off for a week of military practice. I remember that Daniel Ortega's and Rosario Murillo's daughter, Ciudad America, was in the same battalion. She must have been 15 or 16 at the time. Another mother and I commented, even back then, that the girl seemed troubled. We had no way of understanding what we intuited in her. Incest and other varieties of sexual abuse weren't even acknowledged at that time. Years later, when Ciudad America denounced her stepfather's abuse, that mother and I would talk again, remembering the impression she'd given us as a teenager. And then here is another poem embedded in this part of the chapter. It's called All Last Week, and it's for my daughter, Anna. All last week you preened before the mirror, viewing emerging breasts, then covering them with gauze thin blouse and grinning, getting bigger, huh? The week before you wore army fatigues, leveling breasts and teenage freckles, tawny fuzz along your legs, a woman beginning. Today you don't don fatigues again. Today you pack knapsack and canteen, lace boots over heavy socks, and answer the call Reagan and Haig have slung at your 12 years. Yours and so many others. Kids 14, 15, 18, so many others who will go and some of them stay, their mothers shouting before the Honduran embassy, give us our sons' bodies back, give us back their bodies, at least that. All last week, you preened before the mirror, moving loose to new rhythms, long weekend nights, junior high maths, Sunday beach. Today you go off to the staccato of continuous news dispatches, and I, in my trench, carry your young breasts in my proud and lonely eyes. So all the country's children were being asked to do things far beyond their years. In this context, their sexuality was also being stretched beyond that which might have been age appropriate. I tried to keep tabs on my daughters. I asked them to be honest with me about who they were dating and what they were doing, but they lied just as I had lied to my parents about sleeping nude out on the desert. And just as my mother had taken me at my word, I believed theirs. Years later, they berated me for not having known that they were experiencing confusion and pain in many of their relationships. I want to end with a passage that was difficult to write, but I believe necessary to understanding an important aspect of the revolutionary movements in the past century, at least from a woman's perspective. The extreme misogyny of many of their male leaders. This is an issue that has been covered up or ignored far too long. Here then is that passage. This might be the place to speak of Tomás Borge, one of the three founders of the FSLN, another member of its national directorate, and at the end of the war, a man revered by almost everyone. He embodied the contradictions that typified so many of the male Sandinista leaders during the years I lived there. Indeed, so many powerful men in a variety of movements and institutions worldwide. On the one hand, Tomás was a mythic figure. In one of several imprisonments, he had survived a hunger strike that took him to the very threshold of death. Shortly after victory, he faced the Somocista prison guard who had tortured and murdered his first wife. The man had been taken prisoner by the Sandinistas when they claimed victory. He cowered before Tomás's small, compact figure, expecting to receive a death sentence for his crime. But the Sandinistas had done away with capital punishment early on. Tomás looked the man in the eye and pardoned him instead. Sometimes I had the occasion to work with Tomás and certainly recognized his brilliance. I wrote a couple of his speeches in those early years. One in particular, I remember, focused on racism in the United States and the importance of guarding against that in Nicaragua. When Tomás spoke with groups of English-speaking visitors, I was often called upon to translate and learn to anticipate his discourse, to the point where I came very close to being able to do simultaneous interpretation. I also rendered a beautiful book-length poem he wrote into English. It was called Carlos, the Dawn is No Longer Beyond Our Reach. It was dedicated to Carlos Fonseca. On the other hand, Tomás's misogyny was legendary. He absolutely believed he had the right to seduce any woman or girl who caught his fancy. In the Nicaragua of those days, it went unchallenged, at least publicly. He once asked me to leave a party with him to visit the home of a family mourning their young son who had been killed by the Contras. I accompanied him to the impoverished house where mourners surrounded an open casket in which the body of a teenage boy lay broken and inert. We sat for a while with the grieving parents. I felt out of place in my party garb, but glad to be able to show my solidarity. Then Tomás announced we'd been going to a protocol house where he obviously expected we'd have sex. When I refused, he seemed shocked. He wasn't accustomed to rejection. I knew a young girl, she couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, to whom he sent a beautiful dress prior to taking her out and trying to seduce her into bed. He hoped to see her in that dress, an object of his momentary desire decked out in a style he'd chosen. She was flattered by the gift, but managed to escape his expectations. His sense of ownership of the female sex seemed to have no limits. A certain tendency to deception also ran through other aspects of Tomás's life. At one point, he received some public criticism for living in a mansion abandoned by the country's fleeing bourgeoisie. In response, he left the house, ordering it to be turned into a daycare center, a gesture for which he was widely applauded. Then he moved into what appeared to be a small dwelling in a working-class neighborhood in downtown Managua. Several US guests and I were invited to dinner there one night and ate in a cramped room in which the table filled almost the entire space. Later, though, I learned that this house was one of a whole series, 8 or 10 such cookie-cutter homes surrounding a park. All of it was hidden behind a wall several city blocks square, and Tomás had requisitioned the compound to lodge not only himself and his family, but also his personal guard and other staff. What looked modest if you entered only one of the dwellings was, in fact, a fiefdom. Who knew to where those homes' original inhabitants had been forced to move? Tomás had been one of the 3 original founders of the FSLN. During much of its decade in power, he was Secretary of Internal Affairs, effectively reorganizing and commanding the National Police Force. In 1982, he was elected vice president of the Permanent Conference of Political Parties in Latin America, an association of social democratic, socialist, and liberal parties on the continent. When the Sandinistas were voted out of office in 1990, he, like other erstwhile revolutionary leaders, became a wealthy entrepreneur. At his request in 2007, he was named Nicaragua's ambassador to Peru. He died there in 2012 at the age of 81. There were Sandinista leaders who were models of integrity. There were some who displayed astonishing qualities of sacrifice and determination, who made a revolution against seemingly unsurmountable odds, and then the power of victory turned them into unrepentant drunks, misogynist and corrupt. Tomás Borges displayed impressive qualities of brilliance, talent, and also male entitlement. Thinking about the complex contradictions he embodied helps me
understand
that both extremes are often found in a single man. What needs to change is the left's insistence on separating the personal from the political. We must demand respect and accountability in the former as well as in the latter. Leaders able to resist old patterns and set holistic examples of power sharing. So thank you for listening to these excerpts from the Nicaraguan chapter in I Never Left Home. I hope they'll have whetted your appetite to read more. And now I'd love to open this reading to questions and discussions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Margaret. It's really wonderful to hear you reading your own words and also to pair it with the images, which I wanted to say was your idea, which I think was a wonderful one, to see the
I don't know what I was hearing there at the end. It was as if somebody was breaking in or.
I was just saying that I wanted to acknowledge that it was your idea.
No, I heard you, but I meant at the end of my reading, towards the very end of my reading, I heard like somebody saying something, or I don't know.
Yeah, it might have been someone's microphone turned on.
Okay.
Not sure.
Okay, no problem.
Now,
All right, well, let's turn this into a discussion then.
Yeah, so I want to start just briefly with a few of the questions people submitted in advance, and then looks like there's some questions starting to come in on the chat as well. So one of the first questions is the following. In your work, Sandino's Daughters Revisited, you conduct oral histories with Nicaraguan women regarding the revolution and the struggle for women's rights. Could you speak to the relationship between the revolution and feminism?
Well, yes, I can. Bear in mind that I went to Nicaragua to do the field work for Sandino's Daughters in 1979, in the fall of 79. That was just a month and a half or so after victory. Everything was just jubilation, and Nicaragua was amazing at that moment. And women were so visible everywhere. I mean, they were absolutely, as was brought out in the film that some of you saw the other night, Las Sandinistas, Dora Maria Teis was the commander who took the city of Leon and which really led to the victory in 79. Her high command, I think, was made up of 5 people, 3 of whom were women. And there were, so many women in political positions, in military positions. And that was very interesting to me because I had come from living 11 years in Cuba, where there had been great changes for women, but women still were not really in many leadership positions. A few of them were, but not so many. So this seemed like it was much more, that it was much better in that respect in Nicaragua. And of course, part of that was because the Nicaraguan Revolution came to power in 79, as opposed to the Cuban Revolution in 59. So that was 20 years later, and the international second wave of feminism had happened in that period. And so, there were many reasons why women in Nicaragua were in so many more prominent positions than they had been in Cuba. This interested me tremendously, and it was sort of always the undercurrent of my field work for Sandina's Daughters. I interviewed, dozens and dozens of women, probably over 100 women, and for that book. And I remember being impressed by the fact that when a married couple was concerned, very often the woman took a much more active role in the struggle than the men did. Part of that was undoubtedly due to the fact that most of the men had jobs, they were supporting the family, they couldn't really maybe take the kind of risks that the women were taking, but it was still very noteworthy and kind of amazing. I think that the strong current of liberation theology, Catholicism also had to do with this. A number of the women who spoke in the film the other night mentioned that they went to schools with Catholic sisters who were, teaching them to think about poverty. And as Daisy Zamora said in that film, I remember so eloquently, helping was not enough. They had to take further steps, and those steps were amazing. So I was really privileged to be in Nicaragua during those first moments when women were just doing extraordinary things, participating in every possible way. And I also lived there as that began to change, as the men who controlled the party, the Sandinista movement, began to get nervous when women were making decisions. And they slowly but surely wrested power from those women who had those roles. Some of the women survived that, like Dora Maria Tellez, like Joconda Belli, but some of them didn't. And, the women's movement in Nicaragua in those years was determined not to end up like the women's movement in Cuba, which is really controlled by the party. And it failed. Eventually the male Sandinista leadership simply took over the women's movement in Nicaragua and installed a woman who would do its bidding as opposed to having her own ideas. So I really lived through that period of change. And that taught a lot of lessons to a lot of us. But then I was fortunate enough to return to Nicaragua after the loss of the election in 1990 and interview some of the same women I had interviewed for Sandina's Daughters, for a book, a sort of a sequel, if you will, called Sandina's Daughters Revisited. Not all the women in the first book are represented in the second, and not all the women in the second were represented in the first. But that was an interesting experience because almost all the women I spoke with for the second book credited the Sandinista movement with having opened their eyes politically, having allowed them to move into the public sphere, to struggle for change. But almost all of them at the same time, now that the Sandinistas were no longer in power, felt able to talk about the misogyny that they had endured. And so I think reading that second book is really important for an understanding of how things went in Nicaragua. And then, I think I've gotten a little long-winded in the answer to a single question, so forgive me.
No, nothing to forgive at all. I'm really pleased to hear your answer. As a follow-up, there's a couple of questions about specific people that you met or maybe knew along the way. There's a question about if you had contact with Leah Guido, who's a minister of public health, and then one from the chat about Aminta Granera, a former nun who became police chief under the current government.
Right. So I knew both of those women very well. I met Leah Guido very shortly after I got to Nicaragua in '79. She is an absolutely brilliant woman. At the time that we met, she was the only woman, as a matter of fact, who had a cabinet position in the new government. She was the Minister of Welfare. And I noticed in the film she was listed as the Minister of Health, that might have been a very brief period before I got there, but when I got there, she was the Minister of Public Welfare. She was a very sophisticated, or is, I guess, a very sophisticated feminist. She had read, sort of all the texts, international texts on feminism by different people, different women, different groups. And she's an extraordinary person. I haven't seen her in years or had contact with her, but I continue to admire her and love her. Aminta Granera, on the other hand, was a wonderful woman who I met when I did the field work for the second book for Sandina's Daughters Revisited. And she was almost the opposite of Leah Guido. Aminta was a woman from the countryside in Guatemala. She was born, I believe, in Guatemala. I may be wrong about that, but that's my memory. She joined a convent and became a Catholic sister, and motivated by a desire to help and to change society. And after a few years gave up on that, moved to Nicaragua, where she became the first, I'm trying to remember what her actual position was when we met, but I think she was the chief of police of Managua. And she was the first person in the Nicaraguan police force nationally who began to introduce sexual abuse training to the police. This was something very, very new at that point. We're talking, 1990. Certainly in this country, few, if any, police forces had sexual abuse units. So this was even rarer throughout Latin America. And she did that. And I remember that at the point where I interviewed her for Sandina's Daughters Revisited, I believe, if my memory holds, that she said that every precinct in Managua had a unit, a sexual abuse unit with specially trained police who were, able to deal with that. And they were just about to make it a national phenomenon. So she was a very, when I knew her, and I believe she's no longer alive. I don't know if my memory serves me on that point either, but I believe she has passed, but I may be wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong about that. But she was a very open, easygoing, a delightful person, and very smart, and doing an extraordinary job.
Wonderful. Thank you again. There's a couple of questions, if you would like to comment about the contemporary government in Nicaragua, Ortega and Murillo. There's a question if there's a relation between them and the Contras, and then questions about, what went wrong, which I think you addressed some before. But
it's really painful for me to talk about the current so-called leadership in Nicaragua. I knew Daniel Ortega in Cuba long before the victory in Nicaragua. He used to come to my house to use a ditto machine that we had. I knew Rosario very well when I lived in Nicaragua. I worked with her, as a matter of fact, for a whole year in the Sandinista Cultural Workers Association. She was a brilliant poet at the time, but she was also one of the most mean-spirited human beings I've ever come across. She really enjoyed humiliating her coworkers, humiliating people in front of guests, foreign visitors and such. And she was absolutely power hungry. So it seems to me, and I think it seems this way to people who know that couple, that she's the sort of real power behind this duo. People have said that Daniel is not well, and he sometimes doesn't appear in public for long periods of time, but she strikes the resounding voice there. And they have just made a sham of Sandinismo. And it's always been really hard for me to understand and to accept that there are people on the left in the United States and other places who continue to support the Sandinistas today in Nicaragua as if they were the original Sandinistas. From the moment that it became clear, that it became public, that Daniel Ortega had sexually abused his stepdaughter for 19 years, from the age of 11 to the age of, I don't know, almost 30 or just over 30. From that moment, it became clear to me that a person like that cannot lead a country, cannot lead a family, cannot lead anything. And, you know, there's always this sort of chorus of voices as, oh, that's his personal life, his private life. It has nothing to do with his leadership and so forth. And I do not accept that. And I think that, you know, we thought a couple of years ago that people in Nicaragua might be able to really oust this nefarious couple from power, but they haven't been able to yet. But I know that the struggle is not ended, and I'm just hoping that they can take their country back, because it's an extraordinary country with an extraordinary history, so much creativity and beauty, and it's just it's heartbreaking to see it in the hands of a couple like that. Whether or not there's any involvement with the Contras, I don't really know. That's complicated also in Nicaragua, because, as you know, or as some of you probably know, there are cases of Contras who, after the Contra War, began working with Sandinistas, and, you know, there was reconciliation of a sort, of a very interesting sort. So I don't really know. I don't have an answer to that question.
Thank you. Yeah. And apologies for any disturbing memories or feelings that these conversations bring up, but thank you for sharing. Wanted to point out, I'm sharing an article now from 2017 about the status of these comisarias de la mujer in Nicaragua, efforts to address violence against women and some difficulties that they faced when this law against violence against women was passed, just in case people are interested. And there was a question in the chat I wanted to get to as well. On my scrolling, I just lost it. But what advice?
From Jeremy Ranger about gay activism and.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jeremy. You ask if I noticed any kind of openness towards gay and lesbian activism when I was in Nicaragua. I didn't. I was there. I left at the very beginning of '84, so that was pretty early. I knew a lot of lesbians and a number of gay men in Nicaragua at the time, but it seemed to me at that time in the '80s kind of like, you know, a topic that wasn't yet being addressed at all. Since then, though, there's been a good deal of movement. And on one of my return trips to Nicaragua, I think it might have been in '92, I met with a group of lesbians and did a sort of a group interview. I can't remember the name of that, but it was published in Signs magazine probably at the beginning of the '90s or sometime in the '90s. Maybe somebody can look that up. And of course, since then, there's been, you know, a lot of wonderful activism in terms of the AIDS epidemic, in terms of Nicaraguan, gay and lesbian Nicaraguans and transgender people, you know, gaining space, a lot of space. But in today's Nicaragua, the laws are draconian. So, you know, these people have a tremendous fight on their hands. So I would say that the consciousness is pretty high now among the public, and that there are groups working in very exciting ways. but that they have a lot of bad law to challenge.
There's another question about your experience as an oral historian, and if you have advice to offer for someone who's interested in conducting oral histories with any of these women involved in feminist struggles.
Well, yes, I did probably at least a dozen oral history books in the 70s and 80s, many of them in Nicaragua. Let's see, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books of oral history in Nicaragua. 3 of them were with women, 1 with writers, which Jane Norling did a wonderful cover for, Risking a Somersault in the Air. That's such a great cover. And then 1 on the liberation theology in Ernesto Cardenal's community in Solentinami, and then in a parish in Managua. When I first went to Nicaragua at the end of '79, just after the victory, I was invited by Ernesto Cardenal, who was by that time Nicaragua's first minister of culture, to do a little course, like a 4-day course, I think it was, on oral history. And he told me that the students in this course would range from people who had not yet learned to read or write to people with doctorates. So he said, make it pretty general. And so I sort of divided the 4 days up. I started out with just how you manage a tape recorder, those old clunky tape recorders that we used in those days. Maybe how you put people at ease or try to put people at ease, what kind of questions to ask that are open-ended and so forth, very basic things. But then towards the end of the course, we got into the more interesting area of what it means to be taking down somebody's story. Who does that story belong to? What are the ethics around doing oral history? And it was a new genre at the time. I mean, it was still a new genre. It wasn't that my books were the first by any means, but there had been other books, very important books, but it was just beginning to be a genre here in the United States and throughout Latin America and other parts of the world, where people were just beginning to talk to one another about how you do this. Issues like, how to reveal your own class and race and gender status at the beginning of a book, so readers will know, what this is being filtered through, and so forth and so on. So I guess it would take a long time to talk about advice about oral history. There are great books that you can read about it if you're interested. And I would say that respect is number 1, respect for the person's story. I always tried to either send the transcription to the person for correction before I even wrote the story up, or go and read it to them personally if they couldn't read. And then I developed a personal custom of, when some of those books were published, eventually splitting the royalties, such as they were, with the people whose stories were in the books. So I think, respect is an important thing, realizing that the story does not belong to you, that you're an intermediary. And really just learning to listen, something that I had to learn on the ground, because with my first book in Cuba, my first book about Cuban women, I remember getting into a lot of trouble because I would ask these questions that sort of presuppose the answer I wanted, and you have to learn not to do that. But, I don't anymore really consider myself an authority on this. I'm somebody who had a good deal of experience with it, but there are so many wonderful oral histories these days. And I think they're so important because history has been written by white men mostly, and by the men who either conquered or, took over a society. So to hear the history from the people who made that history, who lived it, is really imperative.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, again, for all of
Oh, I
these
see that
presentations.
Aminta Granera is still alive from Estelle Schneider. Thank you for that. I am so grateful to know that, and so sorry that I killed her off.
And to let everyone know, thanks so much for all this engagement in the chat. And we're recording this, and I'll share the link to everybody who's registered for the event afterwards. So you should be able to revisit some of these links. I hope it'll work that way. It should. And I'll take maybe 1 or 2 more questions from the chat, and then I also wanted to give some space for people who feel more comfortable asking their questions verbally. So I know Ron wanted to do that, so we'll put him first in line. And then if you want to use the participants feature, if you click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to raise your hand. Right, yes. Oh, is that available? I'm the host, so I think I can't raise my own hand. But if you want to raise your hand on the participant feature, then I should be able to get to you to make sure that everyone who'd like to speak also space enabling will be able to do so. But first, there's a wonderful question here about transnational feminist networks and whether or not women revolutionaries were speaking to other women revolutionaries in Mexico and Cuba and Nicaragua, how those conversations were flowing across national borders.
Absolutely, they were. I mean, I was lucky enough to go to a couple of international events while I lived in Cuba, for example, one in Venezuela in 1975, one in Chile in 72, I guess it was, yeah, during the paro patronal in that country. And I accompanied women from the Cuban women's movement. And of course, there were women there from movements all over Latin America. By the time I got to Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan women were just much more out there. I mean, the Cuban women, I think, always felt that they had to represent their party, the Cuban Communist Party. And, you know, that was limiting in some ways in terms of feminism, because the Cuban Communist Party was not really feminist. In fact, the Cuban Women's Association, the FMC, was decidedly anti-feminist. And that's changed a little bit in recent years, but not really enough, in my opinion. In Nicaragua, there were women, for example, the women who founded Puntos de Encuentro. There were other groups in Managua and in other places throughout the country, Matagalpa, who were really cutting edge feminists. And they were meeting and discussing feminist ideas with people in Paris, women in Paris and New York and San Francisco. And groups of women would go to Nicaragua from all over the world and meet with women there. So there was a lot of communication. And yeah, I mean, I think that women in Nicaragua are still, as you can see in the film, when they talk about that at the end of Sandinistas, that there are still women doing very exciting things along feminist lines in Nicaragua, and also very connected with women in other feminists in other countries. As a matter of fact, I remember an essay written by Sofia Montenegro years ago. This must have been maybe in the 80s, I want to say, an essay about La Malinche in Mexico. That really was before anyone in Mexico that I knew of had really situated La Malinche in her rightful place in society. So yes, I think there's a lot of international exchange going on.
Wonderful. And the final question I'll take from the chat and from the people submitted has to do with contemporary feminist movements. And it opens with tragedy. In Latin America, increased femicide against women and the murder of women's leadership, as seen in the case of Berta Cáceres, Marielle Franco, Diana Zacayán, and the Mapuche women in Chile. So starts with that. And then what do you think about the political tools available in the feminist movement in Latin America and Mesoamerica now compared to in the 80s or before?
Well, you know, I think that they continue to expand in countries that have that possibility, and they're squeezed in countries that are experiencing an uptick of neo-fascism. So it varies throughout Latin America. I don't think you can generalize. I think women in Chile are just, really doing exciting things. This could be seen last year on their International Women's Day March. I think there were more than 1 million women in the street and allies in the street in Santiago. In Uruguay, women are doing interesting things. In Mexico, women are doing very interesting things. I'm not in touch with all the movements in all the countries, so I'm not probably a good person to, there are other people better to ask this question, but I think that I think it's a mistake when we sort of lump all the countries in Latin America together. I'm not suggesting that the person who asked the question did that, but these countries are so different one from another, and their histories are so different, their cultures are so different that there are very sophisticated places like Mexico City, for example, whereas the countryside in some of these countries is still very traditional. So
Hi,
you know,
sweetie pie.
but
Hey, doggy. Do you want to come over here? You can.
I see that on the chat, there's somebody named Deborah asked if I had had a chance to meet Beatriz Allende, Salvador Allende's daughter. I did know her slightly in Cuba. We weren't extremely close, but I knew and admired her and was very saddened by her death. And I didn't know that there was a book by Tanya Harmer, a biography of hers. I'll have to get that and read it.
Well, wonderful. I would like to give space now to Ron Garcia Fargadi to ask the question you had prepared.
Hi, Margaret. Thank you for being here. So my question is about race in particular in Nicaragua and maybe in the other countries that you live. And I grew up in Nicaragua. My dad is Nicaraguan. And growing up, I never really had an analysis of race. And I think that's, the issue of race is just not something that's an everyday kind of conversation, at least not in the Pacific Coast. I think it's probably more so in indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities. There's probably a sharp analysis on race because they're often the victims of racial and economic discrimination. So it's, in a way, it's kind of like here in the US, we have a very limited analysis of class, and I feel like in Nicaragua, the conversation around race has not really moved forward, and it was only when I came here to the US for college that I really started delving into my own self-identity and trying to reconcile my kind of binational, my mom is American, having this kind of bicultural, binational, identity. And I just wonder what thoughts you have, if you notice your daughter struggled through any of that, any thoughts you have on that thing.
That's a really interesting question, and it's an important one. I think in both the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, kind of officially, race was really as little addressed as gender. In the case of Cuba, it was the sort of the International Communist Party line that class is the greatest contradiction, and once that's resolved, race and gender and everything else will follow, which we of course know is not true. But my children, if you ask about my children, I don't think that I'm really quite certain that they're not racist in any way, because we always had visitors and close friends of every culture and race in our home. And so, there was a distance between the sort of official failure to address those issues and the sort of life that we lived, so that was good in that respect. Cuba has become more aware, and there's a wonderful book just out that I think might interest some of you. It's called The Cuban Hustle. It's by a woman named Sujata Fernandez, with an S at the end instead of a Z. It's a new book published by Duke, just out, and it's a collection of short pieces, a lot of them about race and but race seen culturally and gender seen culturally, what groups of young people in Cuba, for example, are doing today in terms of rappers and hip hop and, you know, artists and all kinds of cultural workers who are taking on those issues in their work and making powerful statements. So I think that's an interesting reference. In Nicaragua, I lived in the country during the terrible time in which the Sandinistas forced the Mosquito people to march to Taspapri to get them away from, I mean, the idea was, you know, a rational one in one respect, because the Contra War was heating up and they wanted to get these communities away from the border. On the other hand, they had absolutely no conception that these people didn't want to leave their native lands where their ancestors were buried. And so there was no respect for the cultural differences of the Mosquito people and the Sumo and Rama people. And so that ended up meaning that a lot of those people went with the Contras. You know, it was a situation that created a lot of discussion in Nicaragua when I was there. And there was a lot of recognition on the part of some of the Sandinistas that they had made a bad mistake. So there was that discussion, which I don't know if it's really addressed in a book or article or essay. I haven't seen that, but it was very interesting when I was there. And I think you're right, you know, in Blue Fields and in places like that, there was more consciousness, of course, about race because they were the victims.
Wonderful. Again, thanks so much for the answers and for the question, Ron. Are there any other people who'd like to ask a question verbally? If not, then there's one question that I have, which I am amazed by all of your work writing in so many different genres and also your work as a translator. So I'd love to hear some about your reflections on translating, especially translating in different genres, poetry, history, memoir, and how that's changed over time. And just as a side note, I loved learning in your memoir that your mother was also a translator and that sort of runs in the family in that way. And so yeah, I'd love to know more about all of your work translating.
Well, thank you for that question. Yeah, my mother, Margaret Randall, was a translator for probably 40 years. She dedicated the last 40 or so years of her life to translating the work of Jose Marti, the great Cuban revolutionary poet. I was kind of tickled to see in the film, there's a moment where, in Las Sandinistas, there's a moment where Daisy Zamora is reading from a book of her poems, and it was translated by my mother. So that was kind of nice to see. My interest in translating really started in the 60s when I was living in Mexico. And my then husband, Sergio Mondragon, and I, a Mexican poet, and I founded El Cordon Plumado, which was a quarterly magazine, bilingual. We wanted it to be completely bilingual. We rarely achieved that. I think only in 2 of the 31 issues did we achieve complete bilinguality. But we had been meeting at the home of a beat poet, a US beat poet named Philip La Mantilla, who lived in Mexico at that time. So a bunch of us had been meeting in his apartment almost every night to read to one another. Poets from all over Latin America, Raquel Jodorowsky from Peru, Ernesto Cardenal from Nicaragua, myself from the US, and Sergio from Mexico, other Mexicans, of course. And so we would read our incipient work to one another. And of course, we were kind of fluent in one another's languages. I mean, we understood the words, but we realized that we just didn't have the background to understand what each of us was doing. The Latin Americans had never read Williams or Pound or even Whitman, and we had never read, at least in good translations, Vallejo or Neruda. And so Sergio and I got this idea that we needed some kind of a forum, and it turned into this magazine, El Cordon Plumado. So Sergio and I did a lot of the translations ourselves, not all of them, but whenever we could, we translated. We published Allen Ginsberg for the first time in Spanish. We published Ernesto Cardenal for the first time in English. We Herman Hesse sent us a poem, an unpublished poem, I think about 2 weeks before he died. So it might have been the last poem he ever sent out, and we translated it into Spanish to be able to publish it bilingually. So those were my first sort of forays into the world of translation. I really didn't have any kind of a formal academic training in translation. And I don't think I was a particularly bad translator, but I also don't think I was particularly good in those years. I went on to live in Cuba and Nicaragua and come back to this country. And for some reason in the past, I don't know, well, in Cuba, I did do one very important book of Cuban women poets. It's a book that's out of print now, but it's called Breaking the Silences. And it was really a wonderful book of about 25 women poets. I interviewed each one, I photographed each one, and I translated a number of poems for that book. And then in the last, I would say 10 or 12 years here in this country now, for some reason I've become very, very involved in translation again. And I think I'm a much better translator today. And of course I've, you know, I talk to other translators and we share ideas about translation. Translating poetry is really, well, translation is an art. It's really an art form. And I think that's not recognized. And but translating anything. So in the past number of years, I've translated a book for Duke, an anthology of 8 decades of Cuban poetry. It's completely bilingual, 56 poets. The oldest was born in 1902 and the youngest in 1989. I published a wonderful book called The Oval Portrait by Cuban women writers. They're almost all short stories, but each story is written by a woman in the voice of somebody else, often a woman, but not always. So that was an interesting challenge in translation to sort of capture the woman's voice and the voice of the person that she was writing in. And then I've done maybe 30 books by individual poets, many of them Cuban, but also a small anthology of Ecuadorian poetry last year. So I've done a lot of translation, a novel, an important novel from the Dominican Republic by a man named Presto Castillo about the massacre along the Haitian Dominican Republic line in the 30s of the past century. So, and I just translated a beautiful, beautiful memoir by a Peruvian anthropologist, Stefano Baresi. That will be out in the States in about 2 months. So I keep doing it. I keep finding pleasure in that. And you know, I think of it as something that also informs my own work and is also part of this bridge that I've tried to build my entire life between cultures.
That's wonderful. So I think we're going to go with 3 more questions to close out the night. One from Florence, one from Edith, and then one from Emily, which is in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. This has been wonderful, Margaret. I've just really, really enjoyed this time with you. And thinking about the film we saw the other night and thinking about films on Nicaragua and also some of the subjects that you've been touching on having to do with misogyny among the Sandinista leadership, for example, and also I think there was a question in the chat about LGBTQ Nicaraguans, and I'm not sure if we thoroughly got to that or not, but anyway, it makes me think of 2 films, and I think maybe both were directed by the Scottish photographer and filmmaker Lucinda Broadbent. Sex and the Sandinistas, one of them. Don't know if that came out in the late 90s. Somebody here might be able to correct me. Then the film Macho, which came out in the very early 2000s, just a couple of years after the Zuila Medica, charges against Daniel Ortega that you referenced earlier. And to me, these are rather extraordinary films. And I don't know whether, we've been asking, do you know, and, do you know what became of, but I'm curious about whether you know those two films. And Macho in particular, I just showed to my class once again, even though it's a couple decades old. I find it's so useful, and it shows a group of men who are working against violence against women in Managua. And I believe that they were affiliated with Puntos de Encuentro, the feminist NGO. And the really amazing thing in this very short half-hour film is that the men do the work among themselves there, but they also travel to San Francisco in the US and do a workshop and sort of educate from the South. So I just wondered if you had any familiarity with those works and with the making of them.
I have not seen either of those films, and I intend to now. Absolutely. I do know that group very well, of men against violence against women in Managua. And they were, I don't know if they still are, but they were an extraordinary group when I lived in Managua, and much past when I lived in Nicaragua. And that reminds me that to mention and they were aligned with Puntos de Encuentro. They were connected with that organization. But that reminds me of a sitcom that Puntos de Encuentro did. It was called Sexto Sentido. It became the most popular. It was modeled after Friends. If any of you are familiar with Friends, there were these four sort of young college-age kids, but in the case of the Nicaraguan Sexto Sentido, they were from the countryside. They weren't nearly as sophisticated as the Friends in our TV series, and they came to Managua to go to school, and one was a gay man, and one was a woman who at one point is struggling with the need to get an abortion, and the different problems come up. It was shown on Sunday afternoon, and it was absolutely extraordinary. It ran for several years, and then there was a sequel. I can't now remember the name of the sequel, but there was a sequel that was done. This was done by Puntos del Encuentro. They trained the screenwriters, they trained the actors, the directors, they trained everybody. And it was amazing, because when I lived in Nicaragua, when I visited Nicaragua in the 80s and 90s, in the 90s, I guess, you would walk around Managua on a Sunday afternoon, and absolutely every house had that show on television, when you could just hear, the voices. So that also became not only an incredible tool to deal with some of these issues, but just a very successful production, television production. So that's what I can add there. I haven't seen either of those two films, but I certainly will.
I'll share the information with you. And I know Simone Howe, we mentioned her book, I think the other night, works, has a book around lesbians in Nicaragua, and does talk about Sexto Sentido quite a bit. She looks at the media, and yeah, that's a really interesting case. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to just preface my answer by saying that I haven't been to Nicaragua since 2013, I believe, was the last time I was there. So not living there, I am in touch with people. We exchange mail regularly and so forth, but I think you're going to get the best answer to your question by talking to people on the ground there. My sense of things is that there is a lot of Sandinismo left, just in the culture. I mean, you can't have the kind of struggle that you had in Nicaragua, where a bunch of young kids really made a revolution, ousted a dictator, and you had at least 5 or 6 good years of social change after that, of successful social change. I don't think you can have that history and then just simply forget about it. You know, I think that it lives in people's memories. It lives in people's hearts. Of course, the younger people don't have that memory, you know, but the older people do. And so I think that probably my response to your question is that my intuition is that when they succeed in Nicaragua in building a movement that's capable of ousting Ortega y Murillo, it's going to be by building on that, you know. And when I say building, it's learning from the mistakes as well as from the successes. You know, when you build on something, it's not just about what you did right, right? It's also about realizing what you did wrong and how to change that. So, you know, that would be my intuitive answer to your question. But again, I don't want to set myself up as an authority on that because I'm just not there, you know. And I think that you really have to be on the ground to understand all the nuances of what's going on in a place. It was really hard for me to understand that in 2018 they weren't able to overthrow Murillo and Ortega, because what I was getting in the news feeds, not just in the corporate press, but, you know, in the alternative press as well, and from Nicaraguan press, what I was getting led me to believe that this movement was growing and it was powerful and it was going to be successful very quickly. So, you know, I was wrong about that. And so that's why I say that I don't have much faith in opinions of people like myself who are on the outside now. It's really important to be there, to sense, to feel what's going on.
Thank you for both the question and the answer. So we'll have the last question to Emily, and then I think we'll close out after that.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret, so much for everything, for being here on Wednesday night, and for all of your sharing so much wisdom and knowledge with us tonight. The question I put in the chat is, I was wondering if you could speak about your papers that are now held at the University of New Mexico, I believe. Who do you hope will access these papers, and how do you hope that future historians and future activists will use that, all of this knowledge that you have there? Kind of, how's your thinking about this process and about these papers been? So.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because next week there's going to be a celebration of that archive. I've been selling my papers to the University of New Mexico, to the Center for Southwest Studies, for probably close to 20 years now. Every few years, I just unload a new bunch of manuscripts and letters and journal, my personal journal, which I've been keeping since 1969. Although the journal is closed to the public until 30 years after my death. I don't want to have to deal with people being pissed off at me. But all the rest of it is completely open. So there are all of my manuscripts, and in many cases, several versions of a book until it gets to the end, to the final version. Many letters between me and other writers and all kinds of people, really. And then a few years ago, I also sold all of my my negatives, my photographic negatives, to them. So they're there as well. And I've, with the exception of the journal, I've put no restrictions at all. You can take a photograph as long as you reproduce it, as long as you give credit to the photographer. But, you know, it's not the kind of archive where you have to pay for information or for material. And I don't know how people in the future will access it, but many people are accessing it now and have been for years. And I think the way I look at my archive is much more about places and events that took place in those places, such as the Mexican student movement of '68, the Cuban Revolution in the '70s, Nicaragua in the early years of Sandinismo, my immigration case back in this country. In other words, it has a lot of material that's historic, not because it's about me, but because I lived in those places. I took photographs in those places. I wrote about those places. Many of my books are about those moments. And of course, there's correspondence with people who were much, much more important in those movements than I was. So I think they're valuable archives. And one of the things that's going to happen next Wednesday at 2:00 Albuquerque time, there's going to be a panel of people speaking about to just that, to how they've used the archives or how the archives can be used. And then at 4:00 Albuquerque time is the public conversation between Gioconda Belli and myself. So I'm eager to hear what people are going to say on that panel. One of the members of that panel is going to be Roberto Tejada at the University of Houston, who's fabulously smart and intuitive. Another one is a woman from Mexico City named Gabby Silva, who has written, I think, the best dissertation about El Cordon Plumado that I've ever seen. So, you know, the people on the panel are really interesting, and they'll have a diversity of opinions. And so yes, I'm really happy that that my archives are at the University of New Mexico, because even though I quit school there after my first semester, it is my hometown college, and I have good connections with it at this point.
Well, thanks again to Margaret, especially for this wonderful conversation, to everybody for attending. I'll be sharing this recording with the link of everybody who registered, so you should get an email to be able to revisit, hopefully the chat. I'll make sure that somehow it gets to you. And yeah, thanks again for taking time out of your Friday, this troubled time, to revisit history. One remarkable.
So I want to thank people as well. I just, I really love seeing all your faces and talking to you with some of you before it started, and just feels really good to be accompanied by old friends and new friends. And it's nice, especially in this pandemic, when we're all feeling quite isolated and, you know, can't do the socializing that we're used to. And so I think that these events not only are informative and wonderful in a public sort of way, but in a private way, fill a need as well. So thank you very much.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again, and good night, everybody. Sweet dreams. Take care. Cuídense.
Thank you.